There are three things we can do to MIDI notes after they're recorded. We can edit the note lengths, change the pitches, and edit velocity values. And when it comes to playing velocity switching or velocity crossfading instruments, chances are that you can improve the overall shape and clarity of musical lines and gestures by applying some judicious velocity editing to your parts. And this is true even if you have great keyboard technique and a controller that accurately interprets velocity values. I'll show you what I mean by way of this velocity switching timpani instrument from the East West Symphonic series. So I got this idea to create a 2-measure long timpani loop that basically crescendos and decrescendos as you see in the score. Now it seems like it would be simple enough to play in, right? But even after recording several takes, I didn't end up with a performance I was very happy with. The part really comes across as though it were notated like this. It doesn't sound smooth, it just sounds awkward. It actually sounds like I had a hard time playing it in and controlling the dynamics, which is actually the case. And as a result, it sounds like it was performed by a percussionist who wasn't quite sure of himself or doesn't have masterful control of tone and dynamics. And to make it sound that way, I had a couple of choices. Choice number one was to record take after take until I precisely mastered the keyboard touch required to precisely trigger successively louder samples for the crescendo and successively softer samples for the decrescendo. Or my other choice was to play in the part and get it to sound mostly right, and then afterward, edit the velocities as needed to trigger the right samples at the right time to create the perfect crescendo and the perfect decrescendo. And that's what I ended up doing, which made the part sound like this. So to recap, here we're seeing the piano roll showing the velocities of the original version. And now we're seeing a shot of the piano roll where I've added the notes of the revised part so it's easy to see which note velocities I changed. And I didn't have to change much to create a much more focused part that conveys my musical intentions exactly and sounds like it was masterfully performed by a real timpanist. So why is it that with my 40-some-odd years of being a piano player that I wasn't able to totally nail this part without having to resort to MIDI editing? Well, I did some investigating, and I discovered that there are certain aspects of the sound that make it hard to play. For starters, the velocity switching threshold of some notes are different than others. Here we see a series of Cs where I've programmed the velocity of each one to trigger a different sample. And now let's look at the same number of notes, but on an A this time. And what I discovered was that the velocity values needed to switch samples are slightly different here and there. In addition, the velocity switching ranges of some of these notes are very, very narrow and located at the extreme high end of the velocity scale. Now, to try and compensate for the problem, I did try to find an alternate velocity response curve in my controller, but in this instance, I couldn't find one that quite worked. However, I don't let this kind of stuff get me down. This is one of my favorite timpani instruments, and by no means is it the only one that exhibits a velocity response that I sometimes find difficult to play. But check this out. As I said previously, controllers don't typically output the full range of velocity values. However, our instruments do respond to the full range of velocity values. So even if I was able to play in the part without any difficulties, there may be some dynamic nuances in the sound itself that I'd be missing out on and not even know it, because the controller itself wasn't capable of generating the velocity values needed to trigger those samples. And this is a very common problem. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes you can get a better sounding part by going in and editing the velocities to trigger samples that you couldn't possibly have access to by playing them on your controller.